Hi everyone! Today I'm going to show you how to make this flurry of love card using the Warmest Wishes stamp set from MFT Stamps and some Daniel Smith watercolor paints. So to start, this is a stamp set that we're going to be using. This is a recently re-released stamp from MFT Stamps from their Birdie Brown collection. And I'm going to start by stamping my image with some distress ink. I'm using weathered wood here. The two color inks that I like to use for stamping when I'm watercoloring is either weathered wood for a cooler colored background, and then I'll use antique linen distress ink if it's a warmer tones for the painting. So this one, we're going to have lots of blues and grays, so I went with the weathered wood cooler tones there. Now to start, I am going to wet the parts of the paper where I want my background to kind of flow into. So I'm going to be very careful to not get the little girl wet at all, but I'm going to try to get the paper wet right around up to the edges of the little girl, because I'm going to do a wet on wet technique here, and I want the paint to just flow all around the little girl, with it being deeper and darker on the edges of the paper and then lighter as we come in towards the center. So this is Payne's Blue Gray. This is a Daniel Smith watercolor that I'm using, and I just love it. It's a semi-transparent color. It's kind of like, maybe it's a little darker than Payne's Gray, a little bit more blue to it, maybe some indigos in there. And it's just really beautiful. So what I'm doing is I'm just dotting my color in around the edges, and then I'm just going to let it bleed towards the inside. And to get those raggy edges on the side, when I laid my water down, I made sure to do something like a raggedy fashion, so that the water would kind of bleed out in that same fashion. So this is a way to do a little stamped image like this without using masking paper. The trick is just to make sure that you leave the stamped image itself completely dry so that the color doesn't run there. Now, I thought that the background looked a little bit washed out and a little more gray than blue, so I'm just adding a second coat onto my background here with some more Payne's Blue Gray and then a little bit more clear water just to blend it all in. And I'm going to try to leave like a real light area around our little girl, because I want it to look like there is light kind of coming around her. And I'm just going to deepen up the edges there with some concentrated Payne's Blue Gray. I'm just using one color for this background. It's just Payne's Blue Gray, and just focusing it around the edges like that, and then just letting it bleed wherever it likes, with, again, a wet on wet technique for the second layer to the background. And I just love how pretty and frosty it just makes the scene with that Payne's Blue Gray. For the snow, I'm gonna just add in just a hint of that with very, very diluted Moonglow paint here. This is another paint from Daniel Gray. It's kind of like a grayish purplish color, and I'm just adding little streaks of color just to make it look like there's some snow and some shadows in the snow. So it's just nothing more than a bunch of squiggly lines, honestly. Okay, so now we're going to let that dry, and now we can move on to painting our little girl. So we're going to paint her in some Christmas shades. So her hat is going to be red. This is Pyrrol Scarlet that I'm using for the first layer for her hat. For all of the areas that we color in on the little girl, we're going to use, 2 to 3 layers of color. With the first layer in watercolor, I like it to be pretty light and pretty transparent. And then after it dries, I'll go over with a finer brush and some more concentrated color. And for the hat here, I just did a little bit of wet on wet there by adding in some Perylene Maroon around the rim, just to start giving the hat a little bit of texture there. So now we will move on to the next part of our little girl. It's going to be her coat. I'm using green gold here. Whatever your favorite green is will work fine here. And I'm just going to add a pretty light layer here, because we are going to go over it with some darker greens to add some folds into her coat and to make it look like there's some movement, like her coat is blowing in the wind. But for the first coat of watercolor, it's pretty easy. You just lay down some, semi-transparent flat color, and then we'll go back in with a little bit of, this is Perylene Green here, and I'm just gonna add in with, again, this wet on wet technique while the paint is still wet, just some little shadows around our shoulder, and then some little creases where the coat might be creasing because it's blowing in the wind, and under that arm there. And I'm just going to add the slightest hint of it. This is still our first layer of paint. We're going to go over it a couple more times to get it more fine-tuned. I'm just adding a little darkness again underneath the arms, behind the shoulder, and then by some of the folds. And then I'll just keep doing that. And then I'll just blend that out just a little bit with some clear water on my brush there. And again, this is just our first layer. We will be going back over it. Now I thought we'd do the skin. So skin tones are a little hard for me. I'm still trying to learn all the colors on how to make skin tones. So the color I'm using here is some raw sienna mixed with a little bit of buff titanium to get that skin color for the face. And then I'm just gonna try to blend in some of those white areas in the background a little bit more. So I just use some clear water there. For the boots, I'm using sepia, and I'm gonna start by just coloring in the first boot because I want us to be able to see that there are two different boots there, and I didn't want the color to bleed into the second boot. So we'll just add some color to this first one, and then I added the slightest bit of a very, very light color to the second one in the back, being sure not to touch the front boot so that the color wouldn't bleed. I'm gonna use that sepia color for her mittens as well. Now I'm just checking to see if her hat is dry, to see if we can add our second coat, and I guess not. So we'll move on to our background. So I thought for the background we'd have a whole bunch of bare trees in the background. So I'm using neutral tint here for the trees. This is a really, really nice blackish gray color. There's a little bit of purple in it too, and I just think it looks really, really pretty with the Payne's blue gray background. And then I'm just going to add the little branches to our tree, the little naked branches. All their leaves have fallen just by adding in these little wishbone shaped shapes and just adding some little squiggles and craggly edges that kind of work their way and point downwards. So I think the trick to making a good tree is, again, just lots and lots of these little wishbones with little craggly parts coming off from them. And we're going to do several trees, and they're going to be at all different distances, so I'll show you how to get that illusion. So for this first tree, it's going to be the largest, so it's going to be the darkest, and it's going to be the fattest. And then for the trees behind it, as we get further in the distance, the trees are going to get slimmer and lighter in appearance, so I'll use less color. And then I'm going to plant the edges of them higher up on the page. So if you see that first tree, it's about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch below where that second tree is. And that's how you create distance. As you add objects to your background, they're going to, the base of them is going to be higher on the page, they're going to be lighter in color, and they're going to be slimmer. So if you just follow that, you'll get the right perspective. Again, so look at that tree on the right. It's pretty thick. It's close to the bottom of the page, and it's in a dark ink. And then as we get to these little trees in the back, they get skinnier and skinnier, and the bases of them start higher and higher on the page. So they look like they're further in the distance. And then for some of the trees that are all the way in the distance, I'm just going to use clear water and just add really, really thin strokes along the back there, especially around where the little girl is. And that's going to give the appearance of like these ghostly, misty trees like way, way in the background. I thought we should have one other tree a little bit close to the forefront on the left just to give the scene balance. So that's what I added over there on the left with a little darker tree. And I think we'll go in again and darken it up Just going to add some more craggly branches there. Going to add in the base. Whenever you add in another tree, just make sure to blend the base of it into the background so it just looks like it's kind of all blended into the scene and not kind of sticking out. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just blending the bases of the tree into the background so they don't look like they're floating. Going to add a little darker color around that horizon line down there, and then maybe a couple more trees that are closer to us by using the darker ink and little wider strokes. Blending it into the base into the background there. And I think we're almost there. Maybe a couple more branches here. Some trees way off into the distance. Maybe even some little hint of branches here and there. Some real light paint. And then I'm just adding a couple more branches to this tree on the left. Making it blend into the side. And now I'm just going to add a little bit more of shading to the snow. So I'm just adding some streaks of Moonglow, and I'll blend them in with some clear water just to make it look like there's some shadows on the snow around the edges of the scene, keeping that area, the snow around her feet, pretty light. Now we can move on to the second layer for our hat. So I'm taking some Perylene Maroon here, and I'm just going to make the little ridges in the front of her cap with that Perylene Maroon. And then we'll add a little bit of color around like the skull area. And I'm going to leave the center of that hat, like there's a little crescent shape in the middle, pretty light because I want it to look like a rounded object. So that's going to help to make the hat look like it's rounded. And whenever I want to take paint away, I just will kind of wipe it off with a dry brush there. That is clean, that doesn't have any paint on it. And now we'll add another, the first layer for her hair. So I'm using some sepia here. And I'm just following the lines of the stamped image there, being sure to leave in some white space so it looks like there are strands of hair and maybe some highlights as well. And then we can add our second coat to our boot. So I'm going to take that sepia again, and right underneath the cuff of her boot, I'm going to add the color around the foot, around the little like bend in the front of the foot there. We'll add some more color, leaving the centers of the boot pretty light. The same for the glove here. Just add a little bit of color on the top, leaving the center of that glove pretty light, so that we just see the first coat, and that helps to again make it look like it's a dimensional object. For her pants, I just added some little candy cane stripes just by adding some of that Perylene Maroon there, leaving the rest of it white. Taking some of that paint away from the hat, like I said, in the center, just to again make it look dimensional. And you could do that by having the center lighter than the edges. And now we'll add some shading around her coat. I'm taking Perylene Maroon here. There might be a little undersea green as well. But either of those colors will work, or whatever your favorite dark green or hunter green is. And then once I lay down my dark color, I just kind of blend it out with some clear water on my brush like I'm doing here. And I'm trying to leave a lot of the first coat showing that really pretty bright yellow, green, gold. Just because I think that it adds a real nice pop to the scene. And that Perylene Green is a very transparent color, so it's going to give me the opportunity to let a lot of that first coat show there. And now that looks pretty good. Now we can start on adding a third coat to the hat. So I want a little more definition between the cuff of the hat and her head. So I'm just adding some more Perylene Maroon there, and then right underneath by her hairline as well, and around the back skull cap area. And now that looks good. I'll just add some clear water to blend it out a little bit. making sure to keep that center area nice and light that we work so hard to get the color off. Add another coat of red down there to our little pinstripe pants. And then for the little fluff ball on her hat, or the little pom-pom on her hat, I'm just adding, this is neutral tint that I'm using here, and I just use some little strokes there just to make it look like there's a little bit of fluff. And then she's going to have a white scarf with a pattern to it, so I'm going around the edges of the scarf, just following the stamped image, and then with the neutral tint, and then I'll add in my pattern, which is just like a bunch of M's or zigzags. And then I'll just add a little shading after I lay down the pattern, and I think that gives it a nice little pop. I thought we needed some lightness in the scene and some white space to the scene, and I think that the white pattern scarf gives us that. Gonna just darken up some of the shading on the coat here, fill out some of the little ruffles on the coat where it's kind of blowing in the wind with some darker tones. And then the skin here, this is sort of a watercolor fail, so I took some burnt sienna and tried to add a second coat to the skin, and it was just not the right color, so I'm gonna take it off just by removing it with some just water on my brush, and then we'll add another coat of that same buff titanium mixture that we used in the beginning, and it'll look fine in the end. So you can skip this step if you like, because again, it was a watercolor fail, but I thought I would keep it in just to show you how easy it is to correct mistakes. Now we'll just let that dry a little bit. Add a little bit more detail to the boots. This is my neutral tint. So after I add shading with whatever the color of the image is, sometimes I do like to go back with a dark gray or a black color to add just some more contrast to the scene and some more pop. I don't often do that with Copic markers, but with watercoloring, I find that it just adding some shading with some black really helps sometimes. For her hair, I'm just going to add in some black strands of hair over the sepia that we laid down, and I thought that looked pretty good. We'll add her eye in with some neutral tint, which is the blackest shade I'm using, as well as her mouth. And I'm just tracing over the stamped image. And then I thought her nose needed a little bit of definition, so I just marked it out with our paintbrush with that neutral tint, just a tiny, tiny bit. I did not color her entire face. I just added a little bit of pop to the nose. Now for the snow, you could use white gouache if you like and just spatter it on, but I wanted to use my white gel pen here, so I took a fresh Signo Uniball gel pen, and I'm going to add in 2 layers of snowflakes. So this first layer, they're going to be really fat flakes, so I'm drawing little circles in here, some big fat snowflakes. I'm making sure to add them over top of our image that we just painted. When you do this step, you want to make sure that your work is completely dry so that the ink doesn't smear. And also, if you want it to appear as though the snow is in the background, you can just not put snow over the main image, and that'll make it look like the snow is behind her. But I wanted it to look like she's in the middle of a snowstorm, so that's why I'm also putting the snow on top of her. I know sometimes when you go through all the trouble of watercoloring a scene like this, it can feel painful, right? For that first bit of snow that you kind of color over this meticulously painted watercolored image that you've just done, but I'm telling you the results will be stunning if you just take that leap of faith and just draw some snow over your main image, because when we're done with this, you'll see it's gonna make it look like she is in the middle of this big blizzard in the snowy forest, and her coat is blowing up, and it's just gonna look really, really cool. So for the second layer of snow, I'm just gonna dot in my color with my white gel pen. And you want to be a little careful when you're going around the image. Like, I wouldn't want to put a white dot directly over her eye, because then it wouldn't look like she had an eye. So you do, when I am adding my snow over the image, I am careful to make sure that I don't cover up a part that I want to make sure retains its shape or its focus in the overall painting. So I'm just gonna keep adding the snow. And notice I'm adding the snow not just to the Payne's blue-gray background, but also to the snow itself on the ground. So it looks like it's just snowing everywhere in the scene. And the snow is going to show up the most in that darker areas. So around the edges where our background is the darkest, it'll show up, and it'll look a little less so in the center where it's just very clear and white. Okay, now we can remove the painter's tape, and I use the deckled die set from Waffle Flower Stamps to get that edging on this piece of watercolor cardstock. This is Arch's cold pressed paper, and I am in love with this Waffle Flower deckled die set. I love those raggy edges, especially for watercolor cards like this. This is Pebble cardstock for the card base by Hero Arts, and here is a version of the card that I did first. And I used the Sending a Flurry of Love sentiment from the Warmest Wishes stamp set from MFT Stamps. And then for the second card, I was thinking of leaving it without a sentiment. That's the one that we just did in this video. But then ultimately, I ended up embossing a sentiment with some white embossing powder over top. So I would love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these versions you like better, and if you have any questions about watercoloring, I'd be more than happy to answer. Have a great day, and I'll see you again soon in another video.